Alrighty, so we are currently recording, so please do keep that in mind if you choose to speak during the Q&A section, or if you do choose to turn on your camera. With that, I'd love to introduce you and bring you to Gardening Wild. So we here love to use native plants in our gardens, and I would like to discuss that today on how we can introduce some of those plants into our gardens and our landscapes to make a healthier garden. So here in Michigan, we're lucky that we have so many beautiful native plants, and I'd love to be able to use them a little bit more. So again, my name is Serocki. I work with an organization called the Southwest by Southwest Corner CISMA. We are a cooperative invasive species management area that assists folks in Berry and Cass and Van Buren counties to better understand and manage invasive species issues. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk about native plants, which are really kind of the best preventative for invasive species in a lot of cases. So the goals for the today, I want folks to be able to walk away with this understanding what invasive species are and some of their impacts, to know why native species are important, both in the wild where they should be, but then in our own yards and what we can do to promote those. I want you to have an increased comfort with some of this terminology, native versus invasive, cultivar, that kind of thing that you may see when choosing plants for your garden. And then I want you to have one action that you can actually put into practice in your garden, whether that is putting in a rain garden, or maybe adding one species for pollinators, or whether it's, ooh, I have that barberry that's just been in front of the house forever, maybe I should pull that out. So I want you to walk away with one thing that you can do to increase the native habitat on your property. And then I want to give just a quick agenda. So we'll be going over a little bit of a vocab lesson. So what some of those words mean, so that we can move into the other sections kind of on the same footing. We'll discuss your garden and the landscape and kind of how it connects to everything. We'll be going over why we choose native plants and some of their benefits, looking into some of the common invasives that might be like hiding in your yard, because a lot of them are very popular in the landscape trade. And then lastly, some of those next steps, the things that we can actively put into work on the ground. So first things first, a little bit of a garden lesson for when you're in the forest or when you're at the garden center, so we can learn some of these words together and use them correctly. So let's see. So first things first, what is an invasive species? As someone who works in invasive species biology, who kind of focuses on this, this word gets used a lot, and it doesn't always get utilized in the same way. So we don't always discuss invasive species as the same thing. So I want to make sure we're on the same page with that. So first off, to be an invasive species, it has to meet two criteria. First, it has to not be native to an area. It has to have come from somewhere else. So native plants have a number of benefits, which we'll discuss later, but we want to make sure that these invasive species have come from somewhere else, because they just don't get along with everyone else that way. They have to be able to naturalize. So if it's something that's just in your garden, I'm not too worried about it. Your tomatoes, I'm not too concerned about. Those kinds of plants that aren't going to be able to overwinter or survive without human assistance, not the concern. They also have to be causing significant damage. So that could be damage to our economy. Something like Japanese knotweed is a species we discuss all the time, because its roots can actually break through things like hardtop or concrete, so it can cause significant damage to our infrastructure and to people's homes. So that's an economic damage. There are ones that cause environmental damage. So if we think about garlic mustard, which everyone should be able to find a local garlic mustard pull right now, that plant actually is a lilopathic. It puts out a chemical through its roots to disrupt other plants being able to compete with it. So that is an environmental damage. But then they can also cause damage to human health. So that would be a plant that is damaging to humans, something like giant hogweed, which has a toxic sap that can cause really severe allergic reactions and even blindness if it gets in the eyes. So even if it's not super aggressive, I am very concerned about giant hogweed, which we do not have in my service area, thankfully. So this is a handy little idea of what is native versus non-native versus invasive, because those are also different things. So non-native plants are things that aren't from around here, but they're not going to cause problems. So they can't always naturalize is one thing. So again, your tomato, They don't survive outside of cultivation, or they're non-aggressive. So Queen Anne's lace, not native, not considered invasive. This is a good example because both of these species are in the same genus. So you have on the left there, bittersweet nightshade, Solanum dulcimara, which is considered invasive. It's a vine that can grow fairly aggressively, especially in more wet ecosystems, marshes, things like that, and cause significant issues. And so that is considered invasive, whereas your tomato, another solanum, another nightshade, isn't. It's not going to cause problems. It's non-native instead of invasive. And it's kind of a duality. It's a little bit hard to draw that line sometimes. This chart, I think, is one of the best ways to keep this in mind. So you have your little Venn diagram where things are non-native but not causing problems. Colorado blue spruce, not native to Michigan. I'm not too worried about it. Isn't known to spread. It's not aggressive. I'm fine with your Colorado blue spruce. Apples, again, non-native, native to Asia, but not causing any problems, not getting outside of cultivation. Don't worry, we have plenty of native species that do cause problems that people don't love. Things like poison ivy. Native to Michigan, has associations with some moth species, so it needs to be on the landscape for some of our native species, but certainly causing some issues for some folks. And then pokeweed, a lot of gardeners reasonably dislike pokeweed, get into their yards. But again, it's native, it's a great species for birds, it's a great species for some of our pollinators, so it isn't considered invasive because it is native to Michigan. Virginia creeper is another one that falls under that category. And then lastly, if you're in the middle of that little Venn diagram, if you are both non-native and causing problems, that's when I'm going to consider you invasive. So something like this Asian longhorn beetle, which just like emerald ash borer lays its eggs under the bark of trees, and then the young eat through and effectively girdle the tree, that is considered invasive because it is native to Asia. It causes problems when it gets here. And so we want to make sure that we're preventing and managing that species. The thing with Asian longhorn beetle, thankfully it's not in Michigan, but it isn't host specific. So emerald ash borer only really eats ash trees, and that's unfortunate enough, right? We loved our ash trees. They were very, very important. Unfortunately, they're pretty much gone in most of Michigan's swamps now. But Asian longhorn beetle, it'll eat anything that's hardwood. It will start with our maples. He kind of loves those the best, but then it will move through our beech and our willow until we're kind of out of it. So that is one that we're very, very cautious about, and a very good reason not to move your firewood. I told you there's a lot of windows, so it might be going a little bit rough today. So native plants are the ones that I always love to get on my soapbox and talk about. These are plants that have their historic range here in Michigan before colonization. So there are a lot of plants that are native to the US that are not native to Michigan. Again, that Colorado blue spruce is a really great example of something that's native to the continent. It is not native to our area. Oregon grape, for instance, Mahonia, native to Oregon, a really fantastic and important native species out there, considered invasive here because it grows too quickly and it isn't native to our area. It generally has long-standing ties to our other species in the area. So the classic example is monarch butterflies and milkweeds, right? So it has these intrinsic and really important ties to the area in order to have a functional ecosystem. This is often dependent. These are often dependent relationships, so you can't just sub in something else. If we lose all of our milkweeds, we're going to be in a really tough spot, and so we want to be careful about that. And then the really great thing about native species, especially from a gardening perspective, is that they're adapted to our landscape. So Michigan, we're lucky because we have a beautiful, diverse state. We have sand dunes on our lakes, which are one of a very, very rare type of ecosystem. You don't see it just anywhere. We have these dense beech maple forests. We have jack pine plains. We have oak barrens. We have savannas here in Michigan. It's a very diverse state, but we have different plants that are adapted for each of those communities. And so it's really important that we retain that diversity, because diversity is one of those things that really, really keeps our landscape healthy, but also safe. So we want to make sure that we are using plants that are adapted to the area, because personally, I grew up on what was effectively an old beach dune. So it was inland, but since Michigan is such a interesting state in terms of our geology, it was just a big pile of sand that had eventually grown grass, and we decided to build a house on. It's hard to find plants that want to put up with that, but Michigan has a lot of great native species that have adapted to grow in those areas, that are used to those really well-drained soils. On the other flip side of the coin, if you're down in Decatur, you probably have really, really damp soils, pretty clay heavy. So you're going to need something that's adapted to that. And it can be hard to find landscape plants that have kind of grown up with that. They kind of want to be babied sometimes. And so you can't necessarily find plants for those areas instead. Instead, you get something when you choose a native plant that is used to our precipitation, that's used to our weather, and that is used to our soils. And so you have to use less water to keep it healthy and less additives to your soil so that it's a little more environmentally friendly to keep that garden. Native relationships are really important to consider in this. So we have plants, again, that are adapted to some of these sandier areas. We have plants that are adapted to our wet and inundated areas or our rich forests. This is pitcher's thistle, this photo, which is an endangered species, lives on our dunes. And so it is adapted to be in these really interesting shifting environments. Our dunes shouldn't be too stable. They need to move to stay healthy. And so pitcher's thistle is really fantastically adapted for that situation. We see some really uncommon pairings in some of these areas. So things that not necessarily are going to always be seen together, especially if we're planting them in our yards, but that grow really well together. So I have seen blueberries, for instance, our low blueberry, in some very interesting places. We also have a lot of plants in Michigan here that are nitrogen fixers. So they have adapted to help settle these soils and keep them in place. And then lastly, of course, we're providing habitat, which is always very, very important when we're choosing our plants. The next word I want to define is cultivar. So cultivars, generally this is going to be applied to non-native plants, to landscape plants. And this is a version of the plant that's basically been bred for specific characteristics. So that could be color or size or hardiness. For instance, here we have a Japanese spirea that has been bred to stay in a very compact form, to stay very small. It could instead be bred to put up with an insect, or to have a red flower instead of a pink flower. If you think of pretty much any rose that you would plant in your garden, it's probably a cultivar, because it's been bred for very specific characteristics. It may not retain those characteristics in perpetuity. So it might be sterile, or it might, when it breeds, when it produces seed, those seeds might revert back to the parent species. So that's one thing to keep in mind with cultivars. When you're looking for a cultivar, you'll see the two-piece name here. So Spirea japonica is just Japanese spirea. That was a pretty easy one to remember. And then you will see the cultivar name here in parentheses, or in your little apostrophes. These names can be wildly different. Sometimes they're just named for the person who created it. Sometimes they're this cute little like trade name, like Little Princess, but it really does depend on what the species is. On the other hand, a nativar is pretty similar, but it is a native species that has been chosen for specific characteristics. So again, it could be something like disease resistance. So I know that they're working on disease resistance in chestnuts, because the American chestnut was wiped out by a disease about 100 years ago. So that would never be, again, a native chestnut, but it would be a nativar of a chestnut, which is kind of the next best thing. There could be for leaf variation. So sometimes people love having, you know, those variegated leaves. That could be a choice. This here is an example of Corniceraceae, our red stem dogwood. There is a version that has been bred to be bright yellow instead of bright red. So again, this is still a species. This is still the species red twig dogwood or red osier dogwood, but it is this Flavermia version. I can't necessarily pronounce all of these because I don't necessarily work in the landscape industry. The thing to keep in mind with nativars is that they're going to have a smaller amount of genetic diversity than our native plants. So one important thing with a healthy landscape is that it has this wide range of genetic diversity, which makes it a little bit healthier or more robust. It's the exact same thing when we talk about endangered tiger populations, right? If you only have 6 of a species left, there's going to be a lot of inbreeding, and there's going to become less and less genetic diversity, and it's going to be less and less healthy. So if you have a nativar, you already have a small pool of genetic diversity because someone has worked really, really hard to make it look exactly like that. So then you're only introducing that one genotype, which could be really, really difficult if it does escape, and then everything in that area is only one genotype. Lastly, the ones that do have some changes in leaf variation or flower color have in some cases been shown to have less insect visitation or pollinator use just because it's not recognized by those species. So if they are looking for a red stem and they see a yellow stem instead, that could cause a significant problem in them trying to better understand where their host species is. So nativars are a good choice if you're looking for something specific in your yard, but they do have some problems that our native species may not. So the next thing I want to talk about are hybrids. So hybrids are sometimes purposeful. In the landscape industry, you may see them in garden centers, and sometimes, like this example, they are not. So this is when 2 species in the same genus hybridize together. They form an offspring together, and they have new traits or health. So for some instances, we hybridize a species in order to make it healthier. So chestnuts, again, are an example. There are a lot of people trying to save the chestnut, where we're doing back crosses with a Chinese chestnut with our American chestnut to get something that is as American chestnut as possible, but resistant to the blight that was brought from a Chinese chestnut. So Chinese chestnuts are resistant to this blight. So if we take an American chestnut and a Chinese chestnut and we breed them, we will have something that's 50-50. And then if we breed that with another American chestnut, it becomes closer and closer to that American chestnut while retaining the disease resistance from the Chinese chestnut. It will never be an American chestnut. Again, it's not, that is not the species it will be, but it will be a hybrid that might be able to serve that purpose on the landscape. So the example we have here is Typha, which is our cattails. We have a native cattail, we have an invasive cattail, and then there is a hybrid as well. In all cases, these are not native species. Unfortunately, the hybrid cattail acts like the invasive cattail on the landscape, but in some cases they do act like they're more native parent. So we're hopeful in some of those cases. So when you're looking in a store, the hybrids will have this X. So again, this is your genus name. Typha is the genus for cattails. And then the X shows that it is a hybrid, and then Glauca is what we refer to the species as. So reading Latin names can be very difficult, so I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview here. So you'll always have your genus name with a capital letter. So for instance, Typha is cattail. We'll have a species epithet, which is that specific species within the genus. So for instance, latifolia. So Typha latifolia is our native cattail, our broad-leafed cattail. And then if you have a cultivar or a nativar, it will have that name in apostrophes afterwards. If it is a hybrid, you'll have your genus name, Typha, X, and then the hybrid epithet, Glauca. So if you see those kinds of different Latin names on a tag, that can give you a bit of a hint. Latin names are very, very helpful. Unfortunately, in botany, we are very, very bad about making sure that Latin name or common names are consistent. So there are a lot of things that share the same common name. Bedstraw, for instance, is a very common name for pretty much everything in a genus. But if you look for that specific species epithet, you know what you're getting. Additionally, there may be like 16 common names for one plant. So it's very hard sometimes if you don't look at the Latin to know exactly what you are getting. Lastly, I just want to touch quickly on invasive cultivars. So cultivars are really popular because they can give specific traits, and sometimes they're specifically bred to be sterile. So we will see folks say, yes, I am selling a plant that we know is invasive, but it's this cultivar. It's sterile. It's not going to spread. Unfortunately, we often see them revert to being a fertile species in a matter of decades, or they're able to breed with something else. So for instance, Bradford or Callery pear was brought here thinking that it was not fertile. Fortunately, it has become fertile with time. It also can crossbreed with other species in our area. Japanese knotweed, this is a cultivar of Japanese knotweed, which has these variegated leaves, which is claimed to be sterile. It is still illegal to sell this in the state of Michigan because it is still considered a species of Japanese knotweed. Knotweed also has crossbred with giant knotweed, which does create a fertile offspring called Bohemian knotweed. So there's just a lot of ways that it can go wrong. So I encourage folks to always avoid an invasive species. If you know it can be a problem, just don't introduce it in the first place. It makes things much, much easier. So one thing to keep in mind is that every single plant has its place. Things that are wildly invasive here are not causing problems in their home ranges. They're very, very important there. Phragmites, for instance, very invasive here in Michigan, but actually starting to die back in its native range in Europe and cause significant problems because we're losing vegetation and soil stability in those wetlands. They can keep it, but I'm not going to decry this plant in its native ecosystem. So when we are looking at kind of like our priority list for what we want to purchase, native plants are always our best choice because there's no risk of them causing problems down the line in our local natural areas. Nativars are our next best choice. They are still native. They're still providing a lot of those benefits to our pollinators, but they have a smaller genetic pool. They may not provide all of the same benefits. And then after that, go for our non-native plants and our cultivars. When we're looking for which plants to pick, we need to look for our needs and our goals. So what are our needs? What is the soil and sun like? How much work am I willing to put into this plant? Is really important to keep in mind. You're not going to buy like a prize rose bush and then just kind of like watch it. You're probably going to have to take care of it and do a lot of maintenance on that plant, as opposed to some of our natives that might be able to just kind of like plop in and be fine. And then also, what are your goals? Why are you planting this plant? Is it to provide a windbreak or a hedge? Are you looking for something ornamental? Are you looking for ground cover for an area that may be eroding? And then lastly, are we looking for something that can provide habitat? Generally, that habitat goal can overlap with anything. You can find a habitat plant that provides great ground cover. You can find a pollinator plant that's very ornamental. So we can kind of cross over these goals a lot of times. Next, I want to talk a little bit about your garden kind of in the landscape and how it interacts with other areas. So healthy ecosystems are very, very valuable. They provide us with a number of things that we both may notice and that we may not. Again, high biodiversity is one of the most important things that we can protect. So biodiversity is how many different things are growing in one place is a really easy way to determine it. So if you have 20 different species of wildflowers and an insect comes in and knocks out one of them, you still have 19, right? So you probably still have a pretty healthy area. But if you have one species of wildflower and an insect comes in and wipes it out, then you have a really significant problem. So we want to be very, very careful to retain biodiversity because it is a healthier area in general. It's more resistant to disease. It can provide more benefits to more types of animals or pollinators. And then also it's more likely that you're going to have plants that are serving different purposes. You could have one that is fixing nitrogen in the soil. You could have one that is stabilizing that soil. You could have one that is providing nectar to insects. You could provide one that is providing shelter to songbirds. So if you have a bunch of different stuff, it's just more likely that you have a healthy habitat. You also are providing a lot of ecosystem services. So one thing that we don't necessarily think of, there's value in pretty much everything in a native forest, and it just is in different ways. So for instance, our swamps and our marshes, our wetlands, which have been kind of gotten a bad rap for a couple hundred years, we're working against it now, that's flood protection. That can absorb a lot of water that comes through it and stop it from destroying high value property or crop. So we want to retain those wetlands like this kind of moist, swampy forest because it slows the rush of those floodwaters, which we're only seeing, frankly, more and more. That is just one ecosystem service. Ecosystem services also can look like the joy or the comfort that we get from enjoying those areas. So I know that I love going for a hike. It certainly helps my mental and physical health. And so that is an ecosystem service that we derive from healthy habitats and ecosystems. And then lastly, there is the inherent value that we get from a healthy forest. And so we want to protect these areas because of that inherent value. We also need to make sure that we understand that a landscape isn't divided. If we plant a plant in one place, it's probably not going to stay there. There are a lot of ways for them to get out. So even if we do live in the middle of the city, the likelihood of a bird carrying fruit from our area or our yard is fairly high. Plants can also be moved by wind or by fracturing. So we have to be careful what we're planting because we are never an island unto ourselves. Those plants can easily cross property lines, so we want to be careful. And then lastly, if we plant something in our yards, the likelihood is that if it's a very pretty plant, we could be creating demand, right? So if someone is driving along and they see that beautiful fall color from a burning bush, well, someone else might go out and buy a burning bush because it looks so lovely. But unfortunately, that's just putting more of that invasive species on the landscape. So the likelihood is that your garden can certainly be a vector. It can have these tasty, tasty autumn olive berries, right, on our property that birds are going to come and eat and happily move elsewhere. We could have plant trades through garden clubs or other organizations that accidentally move on species we don't want, including garden worms, which aren't native to Michigan and can really harm our forests. We could have things like composting or trimmings that can move plants. So you never want to compost an invasive plant if you can avoid it, because it can really easily become a seed source for those areas. This is the invasion curve, which if you've seen an invasive species presentation, you've probably seen. We love this diagram, but really the cheapest way to manage it into invasive species is to not get it in the first place, is prevention. It's why we push things like choosing native plants in the first place. It's why we push things like don't move firewood, because once that species is introduced, the eradication cost only goes up. Because if you have a very small patch, okay, that's pretty easy to manage. I can go in and pick a small patch of garlic mustard. I could go in and I can chop down a couple of autumn olive. But once you have acres and acres of it, it's very, very difficult to remove 20 acres of an invasive species. It's going to be difficult and time consuming and expensive. So we need to be very careful. So we want to talk about native plants for ornamental plantings and providing for our pollinators. Native plants are sometimes seen as weedy. We don't necessarily see the beauty of them sometimes, but things like the goldenrods and the milkweeds are gorgeous and important. I know of a couple of cities that have bans on goldenrod because they think of it as a weedy species, but it provides a lot of beauty and a lot of height, a lot of structure in our plantings. But it also is so, so important for our pollinators because there are species of goldenrod that are blooming for a very long period of time. So when we look for why we're planting native, it requires less water and inputs because it's kind of already adapted to our area. So you're not going to be paying that huge water bill to water your garden. And we're also not going to be stressing our water systems as much. And then we also don't have to fertilize as much, which is another huge source of excess nutrients in our environment. We can provide for a wider spectrum of animals. Butterfly bush, for instance, only feeds one species of caterpillar. It's a great pollen source or nectar source, but it only provides for one leaf eating stage, whereas an oak tree provides for hundreds. So we want to be careful that we're providing for this wider spectrum of our animals. We want something that's going to be less likely to cause these kinds of problems. So if it's not invasive or if it's native in the first place, if it does get out, if it's native in the first place, it's probably not going to be as problematic. And then lastly, look at the kind of beauty you can get from this type of planting. So everything in this planting is native. It has this wide variety of heights. It has this beautiful difference in leaf structure and color, and it's blooming all season long. So that's another thing when you're providing for pollinators. You want to make sure that you have flowers from April until September. And it can be kind of hard to do that, but you want to look at blooming times and line them up so that you have beauty as well as food sources all year round. So when we're providing for pollinators, when we're looking for these kinds of things, again, butterfly bush is kind of a problematic species. It's the first thing when we think of when we think of providing for a pollinator. It's right there in the name. But planting something like butterfly weed instead can be really, really successful. We want to look at that diversity of the life cycle, providing from caterpillar up to pollinator. And then we also want to remember our native bees. Honeybees kind of get all of the love, which I think is unfair. They are native to Europe. They're highly competitive with our native species. But our native species, we have over 400, I think, native species of bees in Michigan. Many of them are individual egg layers. They don't have the big colonies. And so we can provide for them by leaving by not tidying our gardens too much too soon. So I just cleaned out some of my pots because they love these long, narrow tubes is what they lay their eggs in. So the stems are important to them. We really should love our moths a little bit more. I think that they're the undersung pollinators. So things like poison ivy and Virginia creeper both have moth species that are associated with them. And then lastly, whenever we're planting for animals, we want to make sure that we're providing 3 key things: food, water, and shelter. So we can provide food by providing plants that they can feed on throughout their life cycle. We can provide water by planting something like this cup plant, which is a prairie plant here in Michigan. It can go very, very tall, so keep that in mind. But it actually has these perfoliate leaves that kind of cling to the stem and collect water in that leaf. So it's great for pollinators. And then shelter by having these multi-level kind of variable beds. We provide places for them and their young to hide. So I want to talk about a couple underutilized hero species in each category that we might be planting in. So something like wild ginger makes a wonderful ground cover, has these big heart-shaped leaves. They can form really nice, dense plantings in full shade even. So it can be a very successful ground cover for areas where we just want to throw something in. I think boneset is a beautiful plant that deserves more love in a kind of ornamental situation, especially if you have a rain garden. It looks very nice in the back. It does get pretty tall, so you don't want to have it right in the front, but it can provide some lovely structure and backing in these beds. For a shrubby area, something like spicebush is really, really nice. It has really interesting little kind of fuzzy or wispy flowers in spring that turn into red berries. And then it has this beautiful fall color that can be just stunning in a yard. They also are a host for the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. So they're really, really important in our woods. If you're looking to get rid of that Bradford pear, something like flowering dogwood, I think is a lovely choice. It doesn't have that same kind of conical shape. It can get kind of leggy and reach out, but it just has beautiful big white flowers. And then if you're looking for a full-size tree, I think tulip poplars are glorious. I think that maybe is a little skewed because I grew up in northern Michigan where we did not have them. But everything about this plant, I think, is stunning, from those big tulip-like flowers to those interesting leaf shapes to that really straight, beautiful trunk. I think they're just a lovely addition to a yard. And all of these have species that they can host or that insects will recognize and feed on, so they make a wonderful addition to your yard for our pollinators. I also want to touch on some invasive species that you may have unknowingly hiding in your yard. Most invasive species were introduced through the landscape trade, either as food or as ornamentals, and many of them are still sold in our garden centers. So I just want folks to be aware of what some of these issues are. So the first one, I think we all know, Bradford pear. It looked lovely a couple weeks ago when I was out and about. It's one of the first things to flower. It was very, very popular because it does stay kind of compact, but it is wildly invasive. You can see it basically taking over these field edges here. It can actually be a vector of disease to our fruit trees, which here in Southwest Michigan especially can be a significant problem. And it fills in these prairie and grassland habitats that we want to keep more open for our pollinators and for some of our bird species. And lastly, it smells terrible. I don't know if you've ever smelled Bradford pear when it is in full bloom, but it is very unpleasant. And so we can get something a little nicer in there, which again, I think the flowering dogwood is a really good choice. Or we have a number of amelanchier or serviceberries species that I think also can serve in that capacity. Japanese barberry is a species that I'm really pushing to get out of folks' yards right now. This is something that's really popular because it takes no work. So you see it a lot in those like basic landscape plantings when they just need to get something in. They don't really care what it is, and like new build houses, or I call this the McDonald's plant because it's in like every McDonald's parking lot because they don't have to worry about it. But it can really quickly get out of control and grow very densely in forest understories. So it pushes out our spring wildflowers, it pushes out our native shrubs, and it can actually grow dense enough to impact how some species can use that forest. It also is a tick paradise. If you have a forest with Japanese barberry, you're going to have more ticks because it stays nice and moist and warm in that very dense growth pattern. So we're asking folks to rip this plant out and instead plant something. If you want something you never have to touch, this cinquefoil is a really, really good choice. It is native. I see it just as frequently in some of those commercial plantings where they want something very, very easy, but it has these really cute little yellow flowers. It is native to Michigan. It's very, very hardy. And I have seen this like growing on sand or growing in a wetland. It is not picky. So that's very nice. And then also, if you're looking for that red color, something like Michigan holly could be a good choice. It has berries that it holds throughout the winter. So not only do you get that beautiful color, but you also are feeding some of our bird species. The only thing to keep in mind is that there are both male and female species, or male and female shrubs. So you have to have one of each in order to get berry set. Butterfly bush and burning bush I've lumped together because they kind of serve the same purpose in your yard and they kind of have the same replacements. Butterfly bush, again, it spreads very, very quickly. All of those seeds can move really quickly, as does burning bush. And we just have better choices, frankly, that we could have to fill those slots. So something like butterfly weed, if you're looking for something for your pollinators, that is an herbaceous species. It's not woody, but it kind of fills the same niche and it has that beautiful bright color that you get from butterfly bush as well. A viburnum is a really good choice, kind of a small shrub with beautiful white umbel flowers. And if you want something really fun and you have a wetter area, or especially if you have a shoreline, I love buttonbush. I have to plug it whenever I get the chance because it has these almost Dr. Seuss-like ping pong ball flowers that I think are super, super fun. The last group of species I want to cover are some of our ground covers. So both English ivy and periwinkle, which you might also know as vinca, can be really invasive when they get that out. You see vinca in like every forest you visit if it's near an urban area, unfortunately. And we plant these plants because they quickly cover areas. They are just a ground cover, but unfortunately they work like a ground cover in the wild too, so that they push out everything else. They're just bullies. So instead of planting a non-native ground cover, planting one that is native can provide some of the same benefits, but it's not going to become as aggressive if it does escape, and it is going to play nicer with other plants. So again, that wild ginger is a really, really good choice. It's not super showy, but I do think that those leaves are beautiful and they are kind of thick and shiny. I just think they look impressive. And then something like wild geranium, if you are looking for something flowering, or if you do have something with a little more sun, I think is a very good choice in those areas. Lastly, I want to cover how we can build a better backyard and kind of move on and make a nicer space that can be a little bit healthier and still beautiful and serve those purposes. So first things first, when you are managing invasive species, pick your battles. It is not an all or nothing. You do not need to get rid of every single invasive species on your property today, because that's not going to happen. When you are managing invasive species, it is a long-term project. It's going to be 3 to 5 years generally. So it is 3 to 5 years of going back and seeing what comes back up and managing that problem. And unfortunately, that takes a lot of tenacity and it takes a lot of dedication, and it's sometimes really discouraging if you spend hours pulling garlic mustard one year or days, and then you come back the next year and it's still there. But it will never be as much as it was before. And again, you want to catch it as far down that invasion curve as possible. So removing the species that are easy targets first can be best. So if you have one Japanese barberry, that's a really good plan, right? There is one of them. It is a very, very easy thing to solve that problem. And then just keeping in mind that you can move from kind of your easiest fights to build up to something a little bit harder. It can build the confidence a little bit. Next, just build back better. So if you remove that Japanese barberry, if you remove like a bunch of non-native landscape plants, build back with natives. I do not expect you to go out and plant your entire yard to native plants tomorrow, but maybe pick one bed, or maybe pick one like star species that you want to feature. Something like this Monarda, this bee balm can be a great addition. I live in an apartment. I've had a 1-gallon pot of this on my porch for about 3 years, and she comes back every year, despite that pot pretty much freezing solid. It's a great plant. I'm very, very fond. Just, you don't need to do this all at once. Maybe do one bed, or maybe do that spot next to the mailbox that you have to drag the hose down to water. Make it easy for yourself so that you can see the benefits, and then that can encourage you to move on. Add in as possible. Hey, there's this one spot that's looking kind of empty. I'll fill it in native instead of going for something non-native. It is a very easy process if we take it in little bites, especially if we're supporting native plant growers. So native plants can be a little bit tricky to find. We also want to do proactive management, so keeping an eye out for invasives. So even if you do get rid of the garlic mustard in your backwoods, remember that it came from somewhere in the first place. And so there's probably still a seed source nearby and it might come back in. So just do a little survey, do a little management, keep an eye on everything as it goes. And especially one thing to keep an eye out for is forest pests. So keeping an eye out on your trees. This is hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a fuzzy little guy that sits at the base of hemlock needles. And hemlocks aren't just a beautiful landscape plant, they are crucial to our forests. So we want to be very, very careful of this by moving bird feeders away from hemlock trees. Birds can be a vector, by making sure that we have our hemlock trees cut back along places where our cars go because it can be moved by vehicles, things like that. And then oak wilt is also very, very easy to spread. This is a fungus that basically just gums up the works of a tree. So a tree is just a bunch of drinking straws, if we think about it that way. And this fungus grows up those so that it can't move nutrients back and forth. And so this can actually kill an oak tree in a season, in a summer. So we want to keep an eye out for this really distinctive browning from the tips down. And the biggest thing is not to damage our oak trees during the growing season. So starting about April 15th, we want to make sure that's a really bad time to trim our trees, or if we accidentally hit them with a weed whacker, because where that xylem, that water-moving tissue, is exposed is where you will get the infections of the fungus. So we just want to be proactive in the way that we manage for these species. We want to look for some partners that we can work with. So again, it can be a little tricky to find native plants. So we want to look for programs that help us to do that. So the Go Beyond Beauty program is really fantastic. This started in northern Michigan to certify landscapers and greenhouses that they are not producing some of our like top rated invasive species. So it doesn't mean that everything they sell is native, but it means that you're not going to accidentally purchase something that could cause a really big problem. And I'm very excited to be working with them on a statewide expansion for that this year. It's going to be a slow go to get folks enrolled in this, so it's not going to be an all at once, but start looking out for that logo. We want to check out for local native plant sales. So I know the Bailey is hosting one, so that's a fantastic source of these plants, but there are also plenty of other folks that are hosting those sales as well. So keep an eye out and support organizations like the Bailey Museum in that. They have those fantastic kits. So if you aren't sure what you're looking for, they'll say, okay, here's a bunch of great plants for a dry area or a bunch of great plants for a wet area, kind of save you that headache. And then lastly, the Michigan Native Plant Producers Association has a really great list of native producers in the area that specialize in those species as well. Lastly, what can I do about invasive species? So one big thing is making sure that we know they're here. I manage these for a living, but I will never see all of my 3 counties. It's a lot of area and I am but one person. So if you're out on a walk or a hike and you see something that you know is invasive, you can use the MISSIN app to report it. This is through the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, which is a program through MSU. You can download the app on your phone or go to the website, and it basically allows you to say, hey, I saw this problem right here. If you're on your phone, it uses your GPS. You can take a picture of it, tell me how much there is, and then that information goes into a database. You can also use this to see, hey, what's lurking around my house? What should I be keeping an eye out for? And then lastly, you can work with your CISMA. You can work with me. Again, CISMAs are cooperative invasive species management areas. We're funded out of the Michigan General Fund. So it is a program that is set out of the budget every single year to help folks work with invasive species, the Michigan Invasive Species Grants Program. There is a CISMA to cover every single county in the state. So if you have invasive species questions, no matter where you are, You have someone to help you answer them. We can help with identification, give you best management practices. Many CISMAs have a strike team so that it's like a fee for service of, I have a bunch of knotweed and I don't want to have to deal with it. Can I pay you to come and do it? Some of us have grant funding to assist with that as well, to kind of offset some of those costs. We work with our local municipalities. So right there in South Haven, I'm working with the city on some knotweed management and some kudzu management. We work with our tribal governments and some of our road commissions to really get some better practices in place. And then of course, we also do educational programs like this. We work with schools and with troops and with garden clubs to help give folks the information they need to help be partners in protecting from invasive species. So with that, I'm going to start going through the chat to look at your questions. But if you have questions, please do feel free to keep putting them in the chat. Or once I go through these, please feel free also to turn off your mic and ask those questions. Just keep in mind that we are recording so that you would be a part of that recording as well. So the first question I have is, what grows in very shaded, very dry ravine topped with white pine, sassafras, and hickory trees? That is a very good question. Shade and dry can sometimes be a hard combo. Something like Barberry, Archistophyllus, is a good ground cover option. It's a really interesting little plant. It looks very drought tolerant, frankly. It has very shiny kind of leathery leaves. So that could be a good choice for like a ground cover. It's a little unassuming, but I think it's very, very cool. Wintergreen would also probably grow really, really well in that area. So I have a question about what can compete with goutweed. Honestly, some of these I don't have answers for right off the top of my head, but if you shoot me an email, I'd be happy to help look into alternatives. With a lot of invasive species, you probably aren't going to be able to outplant them. So a lot of times it's best to remove them, whether that is through mechanical means like hand pulling or mowing or chemical control, and then replanting something to outcompete it, but you usually can't in-plant them out. Let's see. We have another species-specific question. Let's see, buckthorn. So I have a lot of buckthorn that I need to remove. If I remove it before it berries, can I compost it? Is it possible to burn it? Yes. So if you're looking to remove buckthorn, doing like a brush pile before it sets berries is a really good option. It does also burn once cut, but prescribed burning, like doing a forest burn or a control burn, isn't a great option with most of the shrubbies because what you're targeting is what's underground. So it's just probably going to spur that underground growth a little bit. Thank you so much, Joan. So the information for the plant sale is in the chat as well from the libertyhydebailey.org website. Orders are due the 8th, which is this Saturday. So I really do encourage folks to go and give that a look. Callery pear and Bradford pear, I kind of lump them together in terms of invasiveness. So our question is Callery pear as invasive as Bradford? I think on the landscape, they act fairly similarly. So I would have voted both. And then we also had a question about the pest on hemlocks. So that is hemlock woolly adelgid, or HWA. This is a little tiny sap-sucking insect. So it's about the size of like a sesame seed. Or a poppy seed, mixing my bagel toppings. It's right at the base of those needles, and then it uses a big long proboscis to suck out the sugars that the tree produces. And so it can kill the tree in about 10 years, which when it's something as massive as our old growth hemlocks is very, very concerning. Hemlocks in Michigan also have trouble reproducing because they require nurse logs. So they reproduce best when the seeds fall on a dead hemlock tree. And then also they're a favorite browse for deer, and we just have too many deer right now in Michigan. So we have trouble having hemlock trees grow to full height. Those hemlock woolly adelgid here in Michigan have only been here since about 2016. They've been out east for about 50 years, but our winters used to just be too cold for them to overwinter, but they are doing just fine now. So we have a number of counties on Michigan's western coastline, unfortunately, that now have hemlock woolly adelgid, but there's a really fantastic program with funding both from the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to get that treated and removed. We've been working with them to do survey in Berrien and Van Buren counties for 3 years now. So if you would like to learn more about hemlock woolly adelgid, there is savemihemlocks.org. I believe it's an org that has all of the up-to-date information on Michigan's hemlock woolly adelgid efforts, and I encourage you guys to check that out. Safe chemicals for English ivy. It is really dependent on where it is. So English ivy is a woody species, but it usually often impacts, it's like climbing trees. So the chemicals that will impact the English ivy will also impact the trees. So we need to be very, very careful with how we're using that. And I'm also not necessarily comfortable giving specific chemical recommendations in this format, just because it's very easy to go wrong with chemical treatment. It is also very necessary in a lot of areas, but we just want to make sure that we're doing it right. And so if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to provide you more information, but it's something that I want to make sure you have complete documentation on and not just me spouting out numbers at 10 a.m. And then the last question I have in the chat right now is suggestions for getting rid of periwinkle. Periwinkle is one that can be pretty easily managed with hand pulling if it's a decent area. It's gonna, of course, take follow-ups, but it's pretty easy if you just keep on it to take care of periwinkle that way. If you have a really large area, chemical may be needed, but again, it's something that I want to, if you shoot me an email, I can talk about in my email. I realize it's very hard to read on this beautiful background, so I will put it in the chat as well. And then we do have one more question. That is, are there any programs that work with local parks? I've been wanting to help replant local parks, but I'm hesitant to initiate a relationship with park landscapers. So it depends on who owns the area. I know that a number of our land conservancies really do depend on volunteers. So for instance, Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy has a fantastic weekend Wednesday Warriors program. They go out every single Wednesday to help with restoration efforts. And it's a local park system. So like Cass County Parks, I know, has a really fantastic volunteer program. A lot of those programs are led by like one hero volunteer, just because most of our land management organizations are kind of always very, very busy already. So if there is an area that you're passionate about and you want to get in and start helping, I would reach out to whoever is in charge, not necessarily the landscapers, but I would talk to the parks department head, or I would talk to, if it's a land conservancy, the person who is in charge of the restoration and management on those areas, usually the stewardship coordinator, and they can help you to figure out what would be the best way to start that kind of program. So with that, those are all of the questions I see at the moment. So I want to thank you guys all again for coming and spending an hour with me in a little bit of a gray day here in Kalamazoo. It has been always great to be able to get on my soapbox and talk a little bit about native plants, which are one of my absolute favorite things, and I really appreciate your time. Please do feel free to reach out with me if there are any questions that come from this. If you want help getting in touch with your local CISMA, I'm happy to help with that as well. And please do check out the Liberty Hyde Bailey plant sale this week. I think that it's such a fantastic opportunity to get some of these species that can be a little bit difficult to find at a really great price and to support an important organization. So choose one project, choose one little thing that you can do this summer to help improve the habitat in your yards. And with that, I will say goodbye to everyone and hope you all have a fantastic week. Thank you so much.